On tonight's show, we are incredibly honored to have on the legendary Bill James. It is hard to imagine baseball analytics in 2021 without the incredible work of the father of Sabermetrics. Bill joins us today to talk about a number of topics, from his runs created formula to similarity scores to closer committees in baseball and beating the shift. And later in the show, we'll have our trade deadline waiver wire pickups and a look at some new closer situations around baseball. Bill James is next on Beat the Shift. Welcome to another episode of the Beat the Shift podcast. I am your host, Ariel Cohen, and with me as always, Ruvain Guy. How are you, Ruvain?
I'm doing great. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic, and we have a very, very special guest on today's show. This is Bill James that we have on here, and Bill James is the father of Sabermetrics. Some statistics that are attributed to Bill: runs created, game score, the Pythagorean winning percentage, and many more. Bill worked for the Red Sox for more than a decade and a half, and he's featured in the famous book Moneyball by Michael Lewis. I've only named just a couple of some interesting things about Bill, but unbelievable. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Welcome, Bill James.
Thank you for having me on, and we are not going to tell anybody how much trouble it was to make my equipment work here.
We did it. It only took a few minutes, but we're glad to have you on and rolling. And, before we get started with the show, why don't you just tell us a little bit about your personal history? How did you get started writing all the baseball abstracts, and how did you get into the real business of baseball?
I started the baseball abstract with very low expectations, both for the book and for myself. I graduated from college in 71, was drafted, got out of the Army in 73. And I would have liked to write books, which worked out well, actually. But assuming that I wasn't going to be able to make a living as a writer, I would have liked to just be a local sports writer. I would have liked to write for my local paper or somebody else's local paper. However, being who I was at that time, I felt that I would never get that job. I felt, and I had real issues at that time that would have made it difficult for anyone to hire me. I didn't dress well. I didn't have any background in journalism. I tended to insult people 10 or 15 times an hour. It would have been hard for me to find that dream job as a sports writer for some small town somewhere. So I decided the only way I could do this was to do it myself. So I started writing the kind of articles that interested me and putting them together in a little book. And it took off beyond my expectations or anyone else's expectations.
Well, again, thank you for coming on. I know you probably have a very busy schedule and everything. Now, you are considered one of the forefathers or the forefather of Sabermetrics. How has Sabermetrics changed in the last 5 to 10 years, would you say?
I'm not sure I can answer how it's changed in the last 5 to 10 years. Over time, Sabermetrics has become something a long way from what it was in the 1970s when Pete Palmer and Dick Kramer and Dallas Adams and myself were basically the only people doing it. What we were doing was trying to find a way to put all of the little stuff together and answer the bigger questions. In other words, we were trying to study questions like, why do teams win? Who is better than who? Who really belongs in the Hall of Fame? Who's a better first baseman, Freddie Freeman or Jose Abreu? This was the 1970s, and Freddie Freeman and Jose Abreu probably weren't born yet, but you get my point. That was what we studied, and that was what we called Sabermetrics. What has come to be called Sabermetrics is mostly the invention of new systems of collecting data. We measure very small increments of the game. We measure how hard a ball is hit. we measure the launch angle, we measure the exact velocity and the exact break on a pitch, and those things are called sabermetrics. But that kind of thing, honestly, doesn't have very much to do with the stuff that we were doing when the field broke through in the early 1980s.
So actually, when it broke through in the 1980s, you created a lot of these terms for these new metrics. Which one are you most proud of creating, and why?
And I don't know what the answer is, honestly. I suppose runs created because it answers such a basic question about the game. But the thing I always try to take credit for and never get credit for is I claim to have invented Bring Your Dog to the Park Day. And I was doing a radio show, not very different from this, in Milwaukee, toward the end of the season, and must have been 83 or 84. And it was just a dreadfully boring show. So I decided to say something stupid just to see what would happen. And so I started talking about some game that I claimed had happened, and it never actually happened. It was, and I claimed it was Bring Your Dog to the Park Day, which I figured was just a stupid idea because dog doesn't get anything out of being at the park anyway, and you'd have dog fights and dog doo-doo and people and dogs barking, and you couldn't concentrate on the game. So that was in Milwaukee, and sure enough, the next year the Brewers actually did it. So I claim credit for that. And it actually worked. I mean, I never thought it would work, but it did. So that's the one I'm going to claim.
out of all the metrics, you're claiming as your favorite the bring the dog to the park. That's fantastic. But you know what? You mentioned runs created, and I have to tell you something about it with me. And runs created, one of the shorthands, the most simplest form is OBP times total bases. Right, that's the very basic, simple form,
right,
without taking stolen bases and caught stealing and everything to account. I play in a softball league. And it's not a major league level. There are plenty of errors that go around. And when I compared our team's runs versus the theoretical runs created formula, there was always some discrepancy. We would always score more runs. And that led to me to think there's got to be some way to modify that formula to work for this league. And so I found out that if I added a reached on an error as a half a total base, like a single is 1 and a double is 2, a reach on error is a half a total base. That was the additional ballast that got all the runs scored for my team to be very, very close year after year to the formula-driven runs created that you would have created. So I thought that was interesting to share with you.
Well, it's fascinating. I never thought of that. I've done all kinds of complicated dances to try to make the system work in 1905 and 1955 and 2005 and still work today. But I never thought to include ROE, reached on error, as an element, probably because the data would not have been widely available until maybe 2000. Well, going back 100 years, it wouldn't be widely available until the last 5 years. So that's a wonderful idea. And I'll if you don't mind, I should point out that Dick Kramer actually used the formula you just mentioned before I did. He didn't call it runs created, but he used the same formula. But I'll try that and see if it works in the majors. If it solves some of my problems in the majors.
Well, I would be immensely honored if you would definitely see what kind of factor times reached on error would actually help and give a formula more meaning. That would be a great honor if you would run with that. Thank you for that.
Well, thank you for the suggestion. I'll give it a look.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah, that's just something that, you had an influence on me, and I thought of that, and I did my calculations, and there you go. But back to real life baseball. I said that you were featured in the book Moneyball, and the OBP was featured there, and Billy Beane stumbled on the fact that ball clubs were undervaluing on base percentage. Is there a stat that you think in today's game, the ball clubs are undervaluing? Like, is there a new OBP in the sense of something that maybe teams should pay attention to more that would give them an edge?
I don't know that I can answer your question in the exact form that you ask it, Ariel. However, I would say this. There is still an immense amount of received wisdom / BS that controls how decisions are made in baseball. And I mean, we have carved away at it, and we have eliminated 20% of it or 30% of it. But there's still an immense amount of, listen to any baseball broadcast, and the announcer will say some things which have long since been established as nonsense, and will also say a long series of things that are speculative and questionable. So I don't know that I can give you one thing, but I do think that there's something there, yes. And I do think that there are still a lot of things that could be lifted from our understanding of the game and could be very useful to teams.
Right. Question on defensive metrics. And, offensive metrics are a little bit more easier to see in terms of usefulness. What, in your opinion, is the best defensive metric to use? UZR, DRS, fielding percentage? What do you find is the most helpful and accurate?
I do not know how accurate any of them are. I can't really tell you that. What I use is, run, save, plus, minus. I mean, that's what I refer to most often because it's conceptually simple. I don't have immense confidence that it's accurate. Whatever I learn from a defensive metric, I want to see it confirmed by watching the player or by the opinion of a scout that I value, or by another 2 or 3 other defensive metrics. When there is a convergence of different ways of measuring something around a single conclusion, then I have a lot of confidence that that conclusion is right. But when it's one method on its own, no matter what it is, I never have a lot of confidence that it's correct.
Well, actually, one of the teams that have the best defensive run save this year are the Tampa Bay Rays, and it shows because they have a great defense, a very athletic team in general. And another thing that they've actually put into use is the use of closer by committee. Now, you actually started talking about this with the Red Sox. They never actually implemented it. But how did you come up with that philosophy, and how soon until we see the rest of baseball move to that strategy, do you think?
Well, to be clear, I never actually advocated that with the Red Sox. The people wrote that I did, but I never really did. But closer by committee is a rejection of conventional wisdom. And since I reject conventional wisdom on a pretty regular basis, it is something that people would naturally associate with me. You have to remember, and a younger fan may not be able to relate to this, but there was a period, roughly 1985 to 2005, when the belief in the closer, the efficacy of the closer was at a very, very high level. And every team had to have a closer. And people would say, although it was never true, people would say on television constantly that, you're going to win in the postseason, you got to have a great closer. Or you're going to win in the close games, you got to have a great closer. And this belief was pitched at such a level that it was almost impossible to argue with. Anyone who argued with it tended to be branded a heretic. I've been a heretic a long time. I like that. So I kind of sort of willingly embraced that position, although never actually advocated a closer by committee, but I did make fun of the idea that you had to have a great closer, a single identifiable great closer, in order to succeed in baseball, because you clearly didn't. Any year you name, there are teams that were very successful with either a mediocre closer or just a bunch of guys showing up, whoever shows up today. So the